Hello, everyone, and welcome to another stream on my channel. And tonight, I'm once again joined by my good friend and fellow historian, Apostolic Majesty. How are you, AM?
Hello, Hitman. It's good to be here.
Yes, and so tonight's topic, we're discussing the Great Game, the Anglo-Russian rivalry in the 19th century in Central Asia. So there's a few reasons why I wanted to talk about this, AM. Well, for starters, I actually made my start of doing stuff on YouTube on your channel where we were talking about Russia. I think it was the Crimean War. So there's a link to there, and we've done a couple of discussions. I had you on about over a year and a half ago to talk about the dual identity of Russia. I came on your channel about at the beginning of this year when you did a stream on the parallels between the Western betrayal of Russia over the Crimea and the current war in Ukraine. So I see this stream as like an extension of that. Secondly, there's another stream you did with Semiagog on the legacy of the British Empire. And so ever since you did that stream, I've been interested in the attitudes and policies of the British and modern imperial elite. So that's another reason why I wanted to do this. But thirdly, as everybody knows, there's been talk in the news as to the wrapping up of the war in Ukraine, where there's an attempt by the Trump administration to secure a ceasefire. And in contrast to that, you have Starmer and all the other European nations seem absolutely hell-bent on not having any kind of peace or ceasefire. And I really wanted to understand and study like why that was. And so I thought, why not by actually looking into the history of British foreign policy towards Russia. And all I'll say is I think was quite a educational experience, and we're going to be seeing some interesting parallels. Is there any sort of initial comments you want to make about the nature of the Great Game at all? Or
Just to say that thank you. Mentioned various streams and collaborations we've done before, but specifically, if you check out my channel, there is a video called "Russia's Greatest Defeat" that goes into the Great Game in some detail and my impressions of it. As for a basic overview, I mean, you could call it the Cold War of the 19th century, albeit interrupted by a very dramatic hot period between 1853 to 1856, which of course was the Crimean War. I take a broader view of the Great Game, but traditionally the Great Game seems to be focused on the contention between these powers around Central Asia, the former Soviet republics, what we know them today, Uzbekistan, Tajikistan, Turkmenistan, etc., Kyrgyzstan, and of course involving the relations between those two powers as it pertains to Afghanistan and Iran, and the implications that would have for British interests in India. My broader view is actually looking at this to also include East Asia and the Arctic as well, but that hasn't really sort of caught on other than the more general sense in terms of looking at the purview of the Great Game pertaining to these regions, which I mentioned.
oh no, thank you. And because it's interesting because it's important to note for anybody watching that Central Asia is not the only area where Britain and Russia have friction or tension. There's, as you mentioned, there's East Asia, especially over China, when you have the decline of the Qing Empire. Of course, in the Middle East proper, you've got the decline of the Ottoman Empire. You have the Eastern question. Those are really the main three fronts. I think we're seeing Anglo-Russian tension go on, and so it's also worth just going over sort of the time period. So we're saying broadly it's the 19th century. So in terms of the dates, as you'll see on the screen here, I've got 1907 as the end date. That is traditionally agreed upon as the end of the Great Game. That's the Anglo-Russian Convention over Iran in 1907. Don't really disagree with that because that leads to the Anglo-Russian Entente in the Alliance of World War I. Regarding a start date, that's a bit more debatable. Some say 1801 is the beginning, when Tsar Paul proposes to put Napoleon a joint invasion of India. I've gone with 1813 for two reasons, really. One, in 1813, you've just had Napoleon's defeat in his 1812 campaign in Russia, because before that time, Napoleon and France had their own tendrils in Central Asia vis-a-vis Iran, and so it's only really after 1813 it is just the British and the Russians in the area competing for influence and power. But also 1813, I've also gone for that as well, because in that year you have the first time where I think Britain really starts to take the threat from Russia quite seriously, because you have the end of the first Russo-Persian War and the Treaty of Gulistan, where Russia annexes significant amounts of territory in the Caucasus, modern Dagestan in the Russian Caucasus, but also the eastern half of Georgia and Azerbaijan. And so the British fear that the Russians are just carving their way to India. And though before we get into the Great Game proper, I think it's worth just going over some of the history of the region of Central Asia prior to the Great Game, and how did Britain and Russia become the two leading powers in this area, and also importantly, why were the British so terrified of a invasion of India? And the truth is, if you look at Central Asia throughout history, there have been many invasions to India from Central Asia, particularly a lot of them coming from Iran or Afghanistan. I mean, there's so many conquerors I can think of. You have Mahmud of Ghazni and the Ghaznavids. You have the Mahmud of Gur and the Ghurids. Later on, you have Tamerlane launches an invasion. And then, of course, you've got the Mughal Empire. And so here I've got a map of the three gunpowder empires, the Ottoman Empire, the Safavids in Iran, and the Mughals in India. And ultimately, the Mughals themselves do the same trick as the Ghaznavids, the Ghurids, and the Timurids. They have a power base in the north in Afghanistan, and from there they push down and conquer the rest of the subcontinent. And of course, in the west here, we have the Safavids. They're the main power in Iran, the Caucasus, and Central Asia to a lesser extent. And ultimately, they're able to maintain power for most of the early modern period. But it's very important then to look into, because ultimately, in the downfall of these two empires, we can also see they're very much linked together. So the Safavids, after the death of Abbas the Great in 1624, they go into a period of protracted decline. When this culminates about 100 years later in the 1720s, there was a revolt in Afghanistan, which they failed to crush. And this leads to an explosion of revolts around the empire. And it's only with the aid of a Turkic general called Nader Khan that any order is able to be established. And what Nader Khan does after stabilizing things, because the Safavid dynasty by that point had lost any kind of prestige, Nader Khan essentially just cues and replaces the Safavids and establishes his own Afsharid dynasty. And it's under his Afsharid dynasty that he's able to invade India, which he does in 1738. And what's also interesting is that he is able to modernize the Persian army. So there's quite a large artillery and gunpowder corps. And as we see here in this image on the right, he invades through the Khyber Pass. So he has a main army go in to block the Mughals' main force, while he himself flanks round and gets them in the rear. From there, they're then able to push on, where they defeat the Mughals outside Delhi. They sack the capital, and then they leave with millions of rupees worth of loot and treasure, and are able to extend the boundaries of the empire up to the Indus. And it's this event more than anything, I don't know what your view is, AM, of why you get the collapse of the Mughal Empire. I mean, the death of Aurangzeb in 1701 is traditionally seen as the beginning of the end of the Mughal Empire. However, they still were quite strong. They still had most of their territory by that point. And of course, you do have the Maratha Confederacy further south and pushing in. But how fair would you say it was that Nader Shah's invasion is what really did it in for the Mughals?
I guess it depends how you're defining the Mughal Empire, really. I mean, Aurangzeb, I mean, this is a bit tangential to our discussion, but when Aurangzeb died, it represented the last of the quote-unquote great Mughals, as to distinguish an active, absolute monarch from that dynasty of Tamerlane, rather than the pathetic offshoots that came afterwards. But I think it's fair to say that if you look at the Mughals not as a centralized state, but as a confederation of princes and alliance, then basically the death of Aurangzeb just confirmed that principle. And when you have things like Clive's conquest of Bengal, it should be noted that the Suba of Bengal is still technically a province of the Mughal Empire. So these things do continue. And what the British are really doing through the course of the 18th century is dealing with the legacy of the Mughals' political implosion. And you could almost say that, you know, the sacking of India, sacking of Delhi, again, very reminiscent of Tamerlane, ironically, and the empowering of the Durrani dynasty and the Afghans. You can say that these are, all features of that decline. But I think it's, from my perspective, more interesting to look at the decline of the Mughal Empire as a translatio imperii, a transfer of imperial power. And instead of looking at this as the Roman Empire going on, becoming the Holy Roman Empire, the Empire of Charlemagne or whatever, in the Indian context, I think the translatio imperii is the Mughal Empire transferring its rule ultimately to the British Empire. It should be noted that one of the principal symbolic heads of the Indian Mutiny in 1858 was the last titular Mughal emperor. And so it's only appropriate when the British depose him that the House of Saxe-Coburg-Gotha, or rather the House of Hanover at the time, assumes the mantle of emperor or empress of India in the case of Queen Victoria. So I think that's how I always tend to look at it. I don't tend to look at it as the empire simply being destroyed. I simply see a implosion of political authority from which the British basically assume the same basic principles of paramountcy which they inherited from the Mughals.
Oh no, thank you very much for that assessment. And you mentioned the Durrani there because after Nader Shah comes back from India, he goes on some other campaigns, and what ends up happening is that he becomes a little too erratic and tyrannical, and his generals murder him in his tent in 1747. And it's actually one of his officers, yes, of the Durrani dynasty. I think it's Ahmad Shah Durrani. He establishes his own empire in Afghanistan. As you can see here, he's able to conquer all of Pakistan, and he himself, between 1747 and 1758, invades India no less than 4 times. And again, they're just similar to Nader Shah's original invasion. They're just these large raids to go in and plunder and loot the Mughals, really, more than anything else. But I think it's also important to bear in mind, because I said that the British had this fear of invasion of India. Well, all 5 of these invasions took place less than 100 years before the start of the Great Game. So, and they all eminently emanate from Iran or Afghanistan. So I think the British fear over this starts to make a lot more sense when you understand this. But as you can see on the left here, after Nader Shah's death, the Iran basically implodes into a collection of different basically vying warlords. And it's this warlord in the north, Muhammad Khan Qajar, who was able to unify the country in 1797. And it's from there that ultimately the British and the Russians start to compete for influence over Persia in the early 19th century. There's just a couple of other broad points regarding the Great Game I now want to just elaborate and go over. So, firstly, for those who are watching, if you want any literature recommendations for this, I read a book for this called The Great Game by Peter Hopkirk, and he wrote it it was published in 1990, so it was just around the end of the Cold War and the collapse of the Soviet Union. And what's quite interesting is that he seems to draw a lot of sort of inspiration from the Cold War when looking back at the Great Game. And it's interesting because you yourself drew a comparison, I think, before we went live, that you can almost say that the Great Game is almost like the first Cold War, and I think that's quite an accurate assessment.
Well, just to emphasize why I believe that, this is actually something which is barely ever alluded to, but I think is actually key in terms of understanding the Cold War. The Cold War, again, I mean, I hope people listening to this are aware of what the Cold War was between the Soviet Union and the United States. But the Cold War, basically the common assumption is that it originated over the Berlin blockade in 1948, which was basically the point of no return and the confirmation of the Truman Doctrine. However, my view is that, like the Great Game, the Cold War actually began in Iran, and it began in Turkey, again echoing those imperial fears, except it's the Americans along with the British rather than just principally the British. Stalin occupies part of Iran. he intimidates and tries to force a settlement in Turkey over the matter of the Straits, and is rebuffed in both fronts. And successfully, the Americans able to confirm their control over Persia, Iran, under the Pahlavi dynasty, and over Turkey, which becomes a member of NATO. And again, reminiscent of features of the Great Game, what is one of the last imperial overstretches of the Soviet Union during the last days of the Cold War, and indeed the existence of the Soviet Union itself, the invasion of Afghanistan, which dominates the 1980s for the Soviet Union's foreign policy.
No, certainly. Thank you for bringing that up. And yes, just to address a comment from John, not real name. So actually, Zabisky Kazimierz Brzezinski, I think, explicitly recalled the Great. I'm sorry, I thought you were talking about why it was called. Well, the origin of the term, it comes from the officer Arthur Connolly, which he coined in the 1840s, but it was popularized by the novel Kim by Rudyard Kipling. And I should also say that for this stream, me and AM are largely going to go over, I think, the broader foreign policy and strategy of the two empires. There's something that Hopkirk talks about in his book, where he talks about the idea of the myth of the Great Game, which is this focus on these, various sort of adventurer officers, and people like Connolly, like I've mentioned, France's young husband, etc., etc., and the various sort of little schemes and adventures that go on, exploring around Central Asia. I mean, that was interesting, but I think it's a bit of a distraction from the main foreign policy and agenda of the two powers, which is what I really want to focus on. Vis-a-vis the British, there are really two strategies that are talked about in the Great Game, especially from the Anglo perspective. You have the idea of a forward offensive policy, which is the idea that we cannot allow the Russians to expand at any cost. So we have to strike up alliances with their neighbours, or any powers between us and between India and them, and we have to do this whoever we can, no matter the cost or any danger to ourselves. And then, in contrast to that, you have what's called the backward policy, or the masterly inactive policy, which is it's described as being a lot more passive. Doing all of these various invasions and broad missions to these various potentates.
Sorry, I'm not I'm not as much aware of the details as you are, because you've just been reading up extensively on this. But is that real, the policy of masterful inactivity?
Yes, that is the actual expression. Yeah.
Are you familiar with Yes Minister?
I'm not really, no.
Oh, for goodness sake, you're missing out. Incredibly famous 1980s political sitcom. Sir Humphrey tries to induce his Prime Minister, Jim Hacker, to pursue a policy of masterfully inactivity. I didn't realize the term had such history, so thank you for enlightening me.
Yeah, no, I have heard of Yes Minister. I just never got around to watching it. Perhaps I'll now do so under your recommendation. If anything, I think it's a bit of a misnomer, the masterly inactive school. But basically, it's the opposite of the offensive school or the forward school. It's that Russia is another sovereign power. We can't just oppose them at every single turn. We have to make deals and concessions to them at some point, if we're going to be realistic. And of the two strategies, that's the one I'm personally more sympathetic to, and I think it was the more effective. And again, I don't like that term they use, because it implies a passivity. When the people who supported it weren't passive, they were just being more realistic, in my view. And again, again, just going comparisons to today, anybody who, if you say you're against, propping up Ukraine or countering Russia in any way, you're just called like a Putin shill, or you're somehow passive. And what's also interesting is, all this talk with Ukraine going on at the moment, and all these comparisons that are being drawn to, 1938 and the Munich Agreement. I actually feel like the Great Game's a much better comparison point, especially with these foreign policies.
It is to a certain extent. However, I mean, you focused quite a lot on the political makeup of this region up until your date of 1813. But I think it's quite interesting to consider. You talked about the schools in dealing with Russia, but the question emerges: why deal with Russia? My emphasis on why Russia has never become a superpower. Even during the Cold War, I believe Russia was more of a great power masquerading as a superpower. What do I mean by that? Due to its geography, Russia basically exists in the world's largest cage because it can't effectively project power outwards to the sea. So when you look at its empires, like in Eastern Asia, it's very much, land-based empires rather than naval powers, regardless of the pretensions of everyone from Peter the Great onwards. So it really is, for the British, a question of the world's largest landmass, kind of like, the oh, for goodness sake, I've forgotten their names. The Titans of Tartarus breaking out and being able to wage war against Olympus. It basically will become unstoppable if they're able to project power out to the sea. All of Britain's peripheral imperial concerns become nebulous because they can never equate Russia in terms of hard land power. So it's me saying that and me looking at the history of the British Empire. You can say that there is obviously a logic in what the British are doing. I can't find any fucking logic for what the British are doing today. Sorry for my language, because that concern simply does not exist today by any means.
No, I mean, I don't disagree with you whatsoever. Again, though I think some of the forward school at this time were being a little bit deranged in some aspects, that I do see a logic to it. And I agree with you. The current government are mental. I mean, as Charlemagne's put it in the chat, the arse madness of the current British elites is a continuation of the Great Game. Yeah, I think it's the Great Game taken to its like logical extreme.
Well, it's not. It's not though. It's not though, because it's the Great Game without any strategy. Yeah, regardless of whether you believe, invading Russia and capturing Moscow, is a necessary imperative of the British in the 19th century. At least it would make some sense. Nowadays, it doesn't make any sense because our interests, Russia and Britain's interests, if you look at us as a post-imperial power, where do they honestly collide? In a serious sense.
I mean, nowhere
Exactly,
really.
exactly. Whereas in the case of the Great Game, they collide everywhere. They collide everywhere from Japan to Greece to Iran to India, all of these areas. Even, I mean, you mentioned the Eastern question. I mean, another question is even the Baltic. Britain was involved in the Baltic theater as well. It was involved in the Arctic theater. Can you imagine if, say, for example, Sweden, Norway in the 19th century decided to form an alliance with Russia, whether Britain would have allowed that to happen?
No, definitely not. I mean, they weren't even happy with the Germans holding it during the war. So no, that's a good point.
So yeah, just for people to bear in mind that fundamental distinction. I can understand, even though I don't agree, I can understand some elements of the British establishment being insane with regards to Russia in the 19th century. I can't mirror that view in terms of what's going on today. Insanity and no strategy versus, you can say, excessive hawkishness with a firm sort of foreign policy understanding backing behind it. that really should be the distinction that everyone holds in their minds as we continue this conversation, if we're going to draw comparisons towards today.
Oh, no, certainly. And sorry, I misspoke. I meant to say forward. I said in general. So thank you for clearing that all up. Right. So back to Iran. So as I said, the Qajars very much solidify and reunify the country in 1797, and it's around that time that you do see a lot of diplomatic back and forth over Iran itself. And because what's also interesting is it isn't the first time the Russians show an interest in Central Asia, because even as far back as Peter the Great, he did send an expedition to Bukhara in 1707 that was unsuccessful because they were all massacred by the local Khan. But I think I mentioned earlier that obviously Tsar Paul in 1801, he proposes to Napoleon a joint invasion of India. Napoleon is very skeptical of this, and it doesn't really go much further because Tsar Paul's shortly after assassinated, and Alexander I comes to the throne. And it's at this point we start.
Are you going to allude to the conspiratorial view behind the assassination of Tsar Paul? If we're going to look at various parallels between today and back then.
Well, I'm aware that they believe Alexander was involved, but that's the extent of the conspiratorial angle that
Oh,
I'm
no,
aware
no,
of.
no, no, no. Beyond that, the fact that a certain foreign nation was also involved.
Oh, well, us.
To put it mildly, yes.
Okay, well, it makes sense. well, you learn something new every day. Right. Okay. So, in regards to Alexander coming in, so is at this time that Arthur Wellesley, the Duke of Wellington, is the Governor General of India, and he sends a mission to Persia in 1800, hoping to sign a defensive pact with Farfar Ali Shah, who succeeded his father. And the pact covered any hostilities with the Afghans or the French, though this treaty was never ratified. And when the Russians eventually encroached on the Shah's territory at the beginning of the First Russo-Persian War in 1804, Britain bails and doesn't aid Iran, which obviously they felt betrayed over that, and that's something we'll repeat a few times over the years. And
Yeah, well, you can understand it, given that we did have a more pressing concern, which was an army at Boulogne.
yes, certainly. Yeah. Okay. And obviously furthermore from that, obviously after Napoleon's defeat of the Prussians and then the peace at Tilsit in 1807, you obviously have this drawing up of an alliance. We're going to split the world between us, and Russia can have the East. And it's at this point that Napoleon brings up again this idea of a joint invasion of India.
Sorry for continuing to interrupt you. It's just another little note regarding Tilsit. Tilsit happens. The actual conference takes place between Tsar Alexander and Napoleon personally, and it takes place in a specially created watercraft in the center of the river, and Napoleon is there waiting, and Tsar Alexander comes up in his own boat towards the craft and says to Napoleon, "I, I, sire, am like you. I hate the British more than I can say. In which case, sire, we have made peace." So yes, just to reinforce everything you're saying, the fact that those words were the utterances which basically formed the alliance between the two, mutual hatred of the British.
Perfidious Albion and all that. I don't entirely blame them, but right, okay. So Napoleon proposed this idea, and the idea is the French are going to help train the Iran's army. The French are going to send troops through Eastern Europe, through the Ottoman Empire into Iran. The Russians are going to meet up, and then they're going to go on this grand march to India. The only problem is that obviously that's insane in terms of logistics. Because of the long stretches and distances involved, and of course you've got a lot of harsh geography. You've got the Great Salt Desert in eastern Iran. You've also got the mountains of Afghanistan. So, I mean, Alexander and Napoleon was certainly imaginative, but I do think that was a bit of a stretch that they could have pulled it off. I think what would have been more plausible would have been maybe the Persians doing it and being trained and aided by the Russians and the Persians. And it's actually around this time that two further missions are sent, actually, one from London and one from Calcutta, to try and patch things up with the Shah. So John Malcolm, who led the original mission, is sent again. He's from Calcutta. He comes from Calcutta. His is a failure because the Shah doesn't allow him access, and after he threatens military action, he's just booted out the country. The other one, that's Harford Jones from London, is much more successful, as he's able to bear gifts and calm the Shah down, and is able to get the French evicted from Iran. And as part of this deal as well, John Malcolm is sent back to help train Iran's army for the future, and also the Shah's granted a subsidy. And Britain also at this point commits to aid Iran in case she is attacked or invaded. And what's also interesting is at this point the British are trying to scout out a lot of the land and geography of the region. So they send two officers, Christie and Pottinger, to explore Iran and Central Asia. So they start out in Balochistan, and then they both find their way through Herat and Kerman to get to Isfahan in the central part of Iran. And the main reason they're doing this is they're trying to scout out a potential route an invader could take to India and through Iran. And again, that's something that's just going to keep coming up in this discussion, is this British are constantly sort of poking around and feeling for any weakness in the defences of India. And at this point, and we should also mention that in 1812, again, the alliance with France and Russia breaks down. Napoleon invades Russia. He fails. The Russians counterattack, and he's defeated at Leipzig. And it's from that point that any French influence in Iran is completely gone, and it is just the Russians and the British now going forward. And exactly at this time, I mentioned you had the Russo-Persian War. Well, the Persians weren't actually doing too badly in this conflict, and the main Persian commander is the son of the Shah, Abbas Mirza, and he's able to win some victories. Though it's towards the end of the war, though, in the final battle, he is defeated by the Russians, and it's actually caused a diplomatic incident because Charles Christie is actually leading a Persian regiment in this battle, and he's killed, which caused a significant embarrassment for the British, because technically they are supposed to be allied with the Russians against Napoleon, because the war is not yet over. And then in the Treaty of Gulistan, which on this map here you can see the border. So with the red line at the top, you've got the border in 1801. You then have the black line, that's the Gulistan Treaty border. So that's all the territory Iran is forced to hand over to Russia. So you've got modern Dagestan, the eastern part of Georgia, and then Azerbaijan. Okay. And then from this point as well, Britain decides it will never again send any military forces to command Iran's army, to avoid a Christie situation from happening again. Is also from this point, as part of this treaty, a lot of the British mission in Persia are trying to, again, I mentioned the exploration from Christie and Pottinger. They're trying to map out more of Iran and more of the political geography. So it's at this time that John MacDonald Kinnear, an officer that's attached to the mission in Iran, writes a geographical memoir of the Persian Empire, largely compiling the knowledge and experience that the British had gathered at that point. And he's also the first one to really identify that Afghanistan is critical to ensure that an invasion of India doesn't happen. And we've mentioned, the forward policy and Russophobia, but the beginning of that comes around, and then you have a British officer called Robert Wilson. He publishes a book called A Sketch of the Military and Political Power of Russia in 1817. What's interesting is he was actually attached to Tsar Alexander's army during the 1812 campaign and directly witnessed the Russians in battle. And he used his experience and observations of Russia to write this book. And Hopkirk is quite keen to say that this is really the beginning of a lot of the Russophobia you see in Britain, because it does turn a lot of the elites against the Russians. The book's quite sensationalist. It sort of it really bigs up Russian power and the danger that they are to the British overall. And so at this point, we're also getting some other missions. We've got Nikolai Murayov leads an expedition to.
Sorry, could I lend some credence to that view, actually,
Sure,
regarding Russian power, just for some broad context, because you've brought up quite a lot of context before regarding the gunpowder empires, and look at these borders. Iran was, considered since hallowed antiquity to be one of the world's great powers. And all of a sudden, as a result of this war, as you can see, you have what can basically equate to the natural boundaries of Iran and the Caucasus, areas which the Iranians have pressed and had influence over ever since the Achaemenids, but confirmed over by the Sasanians. In the north, you have the city of Derbent, which was considered to be one of the gates of Alexander, i.e. the gates to the Caspian and to Persia proper. And now all of a sudden you have these territories which were considered part of the ancient patrimony of the empire, have just been lost, and as we know from the current borders of the region, they have been lost irrevocably. You have to bear in mind that the Safavids came from basically a Azeri stock up in the north. As you see the creation of the modern state of Azerbaijan, that patrimony is also split. you have Armenia on this map, and Armenia also will be flipped and will become Russian too. So I think it's fair to say that this is also off the back of a progressive series of, expansive policies throughout the preceding century as well. If we look at the 18th century as the history of, Russia emerging as a great power, then this seems to be a continuation of that. So I don't think it should be glossed over the fact that these losses for Persia really do signify the fact, after that brief hurrah that you mentioned with Nadir Shah, that Persia has been reduced, not even really from that of a great power, but even that of a sovereign power. During the Ottomans' greatest sort of apogee, it was Iran that was the only power in the East capable of stopping the Ottoman advance. The Europeans had appealed to the Safavid Shah during the reign of Shah Abbas, which you mentioned. So I think it's important to understand how critical this is in terms of the perception of the relations between these two powers, and why it may necessarily inform part of the paranoia which dominates the great game.
And no, certainly, and thank you for that contribution. And yeah, so from there, as I said, there were some other expeditions. Nikolai Murayov leads an expedition to Khiva. So he's, again, a more intelligence gathering operation on Central Asia. With also William Moorcroft tries to lead an expedition to Bukhara. He's able to reach, but the Russians beat him there first. There's a lot of competition, because one of the other main concerns is both sides want to expand sort of trade and economic influence into the area. And in 1826 to 27, you have a second Russo-Persian War. This is largely the Iranians' attempt to try and reverse the losses of the previous war. But this war is a complete failure, and they lose even more territory. So if we look in this second war, they lose modern Armenia, and then that in the east there's a little bit there of territory that's just south of the Aras River, getting the modern borders of Iran. And and to this day, the Iranians consider Turkmenchay, the second treaty, a sort of a national humiliation, because not only do the other losses in the previous war confirm they lose more territory, the Russians also impose on Iran they have the right to trade in the entire country, and also the right to station a consul at any point in Iran. So any idea of Iranian sovereignty is gone, and to the British view, Iran at this point is basically a Russian puppet. Would you say that's a fair point, or?
I wouldn't necessarily say a Russian puppet, but that view is confirmed if you try and understand the strategic rationale of the British declaring war on Iran just after the Crimean War. But yes, it's not necessarily the reality of that, but it's the fear of that which informs so much of British foreign policy that leads up to the convention on Iran. If there's going to be any puppeting doing here, it needs to be the British doing it, or to be forced into some sort of uneasy equilibrium, because obviously the Russians being able to control northern Iran allows them to dominate the entirety of the Caspian Sea. If we look at Russia's territory a little bit further into the reign of Alexander II, when they expand up into the other Gate of Alexander, which will be the east of the Mazandran, it seems logical that these territories would also fall under Russia as well. So yes, even though I don't think it's necessarily fair to see Iran as a puppet, you can say it's no longer the bulwark which can possibly serve British interests against India. And indeed, the other fear is not just for India, but if the Russians expand to the Persian Gulf, this of course is before the period where oil is discovered, even though it should be noted why this is so significant to Russia, moreover, even though they wouldn't understand it yet. Baku would, during the late 19th century, early 20th century, be one of the world's largest areas for the extraction of oil. So another thing to note regarding this. But if the Russians were to expand to Khuzestan, or they were to expand to Hormuz and control the Straits of Hormuz, you can then understand why the British decided to take over places like what is now the United Arab Emirates, or Qatar, or Kuwait, to again stop that possible eventuality of the Russians seizing control of the other half of the Persian Gulf.
No, certainly, and thank you for bringing that up. And because it's from this point I want to shift over towards India and Afghanistan. So obviously it's around this time in India the British have been steadily consolidating their position over India after the 7 Years' War, and because in the northeast, their main ally in this region as a bulwark against Afghanistan is you've got the Sikh Empire of Ranjit Singh, and he has quite a long reign. He reigns from 1801 to 1839, and yeah, so at this point we actually have the career of another important officer in the early part of the years of the Great Game. You have Alexander Burnes. He goes on a mission to the Sikh Empire in 1831, and this is again to shore and prop up this alliance, because over in Afghanistan, the Emirates was ruled by a ruler called Dost Muhammad of the Barakzaya dynasty, because the Durrani had been overthrown in most of the country. They were only clinging on to the Western Emirate of Herat, which the Qajars had designs on, which we'll get to shortly. Because there was actually a rivalry between Ranjit Singh and Dost Muhammad, because Ranjit Singh had actually conquered Peshawar and some border territory from the Afghans, and Dost Muhammad very much wanted that territory back. And it's after this Burnes goes on a mission to Dost Muhammad, because the British, though they've got Ranjit Singh, they still do want a strong ruler in Afghanistan that's aligned with the British to act as a bulwark to the Russians. And Burnes believes Dost Muhammad is the best man for the job, rather than, say, trying to help the Emir of Herat take over the country. And so he's able to shore up some relation, but ultimately it does sour in the long term, because Dost Muhammad really wants the return of his lost territory, and the Lord Ellenborough, the Governor General of India, just will not make any concessions. And it's from this that the Russians send their own mission to Dost Muhammad in Afghanistan, and as Captain Vikovich. So at this point, the British concerns over a potential attack from Afghanistan, the Russians, are at an all-time high. And it's at this point they decide that Dost Muhammad has to be deposed, and they're going to restore the former Durrani ruler of Afghanistan, Shah Shuja, to the throne. And we have the first Anglo-Afghan War, and which would be one of the worst military disasters in British history. The war initially goes relatively well. They're able to capture Kandahar, Ghazni, and Kabul relatively quickly and place Shuja on the throne. Dost Muhammad flees, but as time goes on, a lot of the Afghans aren't happy with the presence of the British mission in Kabul, because the British had hoped that by Shah Shuja being placed on the throne, he would be able to rally the tribes to himself to basically make Afghanistan self-defending. But because he's not able to, and he's not as legitimate or popular as they thought, they are forced to leave a large army in Kabul to secure the region under the British emissary to Afghanistan, McNarton, with Burnes as his political aide. It's at this point that the British are forced to withdraw from Kabul, because there is a riot where Burnes is killed, and this is largely a result of the indecisiveness of the British General Elphinstone and McNarton arguing over what to do with the situation, as the Afghans riot in the streets and burn down the buildings and seize the British treasury. And so in this emergency situation, where the tribes then start descending on the British cantonments and barracks, the British are then forced to negotiate with Dost Muhammad's son, Muhammad Akbar. They agree they're going to withdraw. However, he betrays them, has McNarton killed, and then agrees another deal where they can leave, but they have to leave hostages, and then betrays them again and harasses them through the Khyber Pass all the way back to India. After this humiliation, a punitive expedition is sent back to Afghanistan to try and salvage some prestige from this mess. Britain re-enters Afghanistan in 1842. We recapture Kabul. We execute a load of the Afghans, and then we leave, and Dost Muhammad ends up coming back on the throne. And so again, a bit of a waste of time, this whole conflict, because we invaded Afghanistan, got several thousands, hundreds of men of British men killed, only for the same ruler to end up back on the throne anyway. The only good thing that came of it is Dost Muhammad decides to, after spending time in exile in India and realizing how much of a threat we ourselves were to him, decides to comply and not cause us any more trouble. I mean, what's your assessment of the conflict? And would you agree it was a bit of a waste of time, or?
Well, I mean, it has all the hallmarks of an attempt at regime change, but what can you say other than what was the serious threat posed by Russia in terms of involving this conflict, essentially? um, Again, the British are no sort of um, strangers to the idea of regime change being implemented throughout all of India. It just seems very obviously that this is part of a great imperial overstretch and would lend credence to the idea of having a more withdrawn strategy when it comes to this to avoid such a disaster. And you mentioned his long reign, whether that disaster would have actually materialized into a Russian alliance later down the line. So, yeah, a disaster.
And another point I should mention is Britain originally actually wanted Ranjit Singh and the Sikhs to do the invasion, but he actually very wisely decided against this, and that's why the British ended up doing it. So I have to wonder, had Ranjit Singh done it, the British maybe could have avoided a risk to themselves there. But danger, as you may have exacerbated and caused a long drawn out war between the two powers. So I think the safest thing would have been to have not to start the war to begin with. But so it's from this point actually in 1840. Oh, sorry, did you want to say something?
No, I was just going to say that, I'm sure that the ruler of the Sikh Empire would have seen it as a pretext for the British to stab him in the back. So no wonder why he refused them. Sending all those troops into the graveyard of empires while the British gobble up the territory, which of course they did.
Mm. Yes, because you should mention as well that that ultimately Ranjit Singh would actually die in 1839, the year after the war started. And there's a bit of an interesting counterfactual that came to my mind, AM, I want your opinion on, because considering, Ranjit Singh, Dost Muhammad's great rival, dies a year after the war starts, I had to wonder, what if British had been a little bit more patient? What if, because ultimately when Ranjit Singh dies, there's a succession of different Maharajas, the Sikh Empire becomes rather unstable, and that's largely the reason why we invade and carve it up and create the new princely state of Kashmir and Jammu out of it in the north. I have to wonder, had we been a little bit more patient and just proposed to Dost Muhammad, you want the return of Peshawar, okay. If you help us carve up the Sikh Empire, we will give you back Peshawar and you have to commit to an alliance with us. To me, that seemed a much more better solution than what we ultimately went with. Would you say that's fair?
Not necessarily. I think in the end, the British were able to very successfully carve out paramountcy in India in general. So it's not really a counterfactual I ever considered. I would need to sort of ponder it at more length.
Okay, no, that's fair. It's only a minor point. So, okay, so it's from this point, because I mentioned Herat and Iran. So obviously Iran's lost these territories in the Caucasus to the Russians. Is at this point that because Herat in the western part of Afghanistan was historically part of the Safavid and the Afsharid empires, and it was a highly Persianized city, and the Shahs very much wanted it back, and the Russian consul Simovich does actually suggest to the Shah, who's come in, it's Muhammad Shah Qajar, to conquer and invade Herat, and he actually accompanies the army that besieges the city, and it's with the assistance of the British officer Eldred Pottinger, nephew of the other Pottinger I mentioned earlier, who's able to rally the defence of the city, because the British consider Herat absolutely critical to the defence of India, because Herat lies just north of Balochistan and some of the key passes through the Hindu Kush mountains to India. So that was why they were so keen on that not falling, because in their view, if the Persians take Herat, it's basically given the Russians access to Herat and another invasion route into India. So this first attempt is in 1837, and the British use gunboat diplomacy, they land a fleet at Bushehr and take the town, and the Iranians capitulate and withdraw. And then later on in 1853, during the Crimean War, they try the same thing again. This time they actually do succeed in taking Herat, but again, we send another expedition in, threaten war, and again the Shah backs down, and so was the last attempt the Iranians ever did to try and recover any of their lost territory. And I think it's from that point that it really confirms their rather weakened status. Okay, and it's also worth, because I mentioned 1853, which is during the Crimean War, that there's an interesting period from 1843 to 1853 where there's a bit of because it's actually funny because we talk about the Cold War. Hopkirk in the book actually refers to this 10-year period from 1843 after the first Anglo-Afghan War to the Crimean War as a kind of detente, which I think is fair. There's a general attempt to try and have good constructive relations with the Russians and try and recognize some sort of sphere of influence, especially over what to do with the Ottoman Empire and the Eastern question. And of course, when Tsar Nicholas found out we had very different intentions towards the Ottoman Empire than he'd anticipated, we have the Crimean War. The Russians are humiliated, and they're forced to disband their Black Sea Fleet and not put any more naval units there. And it's also during the Crimean War we see another interesting episode, because at this time the Russians are still trying to consolidate the Caucasus, because you have the Circassians are rising up against Russian rule, and the British at various points in the early part of the 19th century are considering aiding the Circassians against the Russians. In fact, there was trying to remember the chap's name, but there was an individual we'd sent as the ambassador to the Sublime Porte who was very sympathetic to the Circassians, and he actually orders a ship called the Vixen to sail to the Circassians to give them supplies and weapons, but that ship's actually captured by the Russians and prevented from doing its job. So that's an incident that leads to that individual's withdrawal. Later on during the Crimean War, this flares up again. The British are also considering supporting the Circassians, and I actually the other night was watching Semi-Agog did a stream with Jayotapal on the Circassians, and he's very much of his opinion that we're largely responsible for the Circassian genocide, essentially encouraging them to rise up and then abandoning them at the last moment to the mercies of the Russians. And I see a really dark parallel, because on another stream on my channel I did with my friend Hunger, we were looking at the fate of Middle Eastern minorities such as the Armenians and the Assyrians, and if anything, what we did with the Assyrians seems to have first played out with the Circassians. Unfortunately, would you say that's a fair assessment, or?
What do you mean we regarding the Assyrians?
I mean the British. Sorry.
I think it's more sort of tit for tat regarding. I mean, I don't really want to get into a conversation about the Assyrians because that would lead down to a major tangent. But just to emphasize why the British would try to appeal to the Circassians. I'm not sure if you have a map up here, but Circassia, the territory, is basically lodged between Kuban, the Crimea, and the Caucasus Mountain region, and it's also adjacent to some other slightly unruly populations like the Kalmucks. So if this region were to forge out to the extreme northwest of that map, if that region were to carve out an independent state, or at the very least just an outlet for a British bridgehead, it could basically act as some sort of point to split the Caucasus from the rest of Russia. So you can understand in part why the Russians decided to deal with this region in the most horrific way possible to end any threat of this population from arising again. And those who survive, many of whom resettle in Turkey and become subjects of the Ottoman Sultan. So yes.
No, thank you. And so Iron Duke's just comment, yeah, man, if you don't mention Napier and Picarvi, the Latin for I have sinned, I'll never forgive you. Sorry, I've heard the name Napier, but I'm not quite sure what that's a reference to. So sorry if I've annoyed you, Iron Duke. Do you have any idea what he's referring to, AM?
Sorry, not off the top of my head. I'll have to remember.
Yeah, because I'm pretty sure it's nothing to do with the Great Game, because I'm sure it would have been mentioned in the Hopkirk book. So hopefully you can clarify for us in the chat, Iron Duke, what you're referring to there.
Does he mean Sir Charles Napier?
Possibly.
It was an Indian general, or a general in the service of British India, rather.
Wouldn't this be to do with the mutiny, I'm presuming, or?
I don't know.
Right. Well, just to go back to the Crimean War, because there's also something interesting, because there's a Russian general, Duhamel, who actually draws up a invasion of India. But there's an interesting take from Hopkirk where he says that this invasion plan actually gets leaked, and he has an argument that the Russians deliberately leak this plan in order to get the British to put more troops in India, so they're in India and not in the Crimea, which I think is quite interesting. I wouldn't put it past the Russians, especially if they don't want to be humiliated on their home turf, so to speak. Yeah. So after the Crimean War, because I mentioned the mutiny, yes, because in 1856, yes, there was a large uprising in India after many Hindu and Muslim soldiers rebel over the usage of cow fat and pig fat cartridges in their ammunition that they're forced to bite into. But there's other reasons for the mutiny as well. So this large uprising, it's crushed after about a year, and we have the end of the East India Company and the creation of the British Raj. And sorry, is there something you wanted to add, or?
No, I was just thinking that part of the reason why it does so well, you talked about the mutiny, but why did so many Indian princes join sides? It was due to something called the doctrine of lapse, where,
yes, I've heard of that.
Where the British, even though this was still the East India Company, it wasn't the British Empire in India, they took it upon themselves to have the right to escheat various territories into what was, the precursor to British India. What do I mean by escheat? I mean territories basically revert back to the sovereign ruler when a ruler's line is extinguished. It's common practice among feudal states, and of course, this was seen as a threat to all of the princely rulers who had either willingly or been coerced into an alliance with the British. Why is this significant? Because, of course, it informs how the British would deal with subservient powers who they were nominally allied to, and indeed would inform us a bit about how the Russians treated their subject states as well.
I know, certainly. Thank you for that, and bit of context. And sorry. So Charles Napier captured Sind in 1842 and sent the message to Picarvi. Yes, so sorry, because it's at this time that around the time of the Anglo-Afghan War, Britain does try to consolidate its borders, because obviously we talked about the Anglo-Sikh Wars, but yes, they also conquer Sindh, which is this little bit of Pakistan that's on the border with the Khanate of Kalat here on the map. No, thank you for that, Iron Duke. I nearly would have forgotten if you'd not mentioned that, but no, it's important in terms of trying to consolidate the northwest frontier at this time. And okay. And obviously, it's around this time that, obviously, during the Crimean War, Tsar Nicholas dies, and you have Alexander II come to the throne. And it's largely under him you start to see a strong Russian interest in conquering the various Central Asian Khanates. And if we just look at this map in the middle, there's about three. You can see there's the Khanate of Khiva, the Emirate of Bukhara, and the Khanate of Kokand. And these states are in like an intermittent state of war between themselves, and the borders don't really change very much. It's largely just mostly raids for slaves more than anything else. So what he does is this first expedition that's sent at this time to sort of probe for a potential conquest is under Nikolai Ignatieff in 1858, and what's also interesting, linking this to Persian Russian designs in the east, Ignatieff later goes on to secure the Treaty of Peking with the Qing in 1860, where Russia annexes the Transamur, the territory to the northern of the Amur River, and this is largely to counter the British influence that's coming in as a result of the Opium Wars, and also to secure a port in the east. And you've got the creation of Vladivostok, the ruler of the east, as well. And from this point, going back to Central Asia, Mikhail Cherniyev exploits a war between the Khans of Kokand and Bukhara to seize Tashkent on the 15th of June 1865. This is important because Tashkent is the largest and wealthiest city in Central Asia, and so it's quite a valuable prize for the Russians to capture it. And they're able to consolidate this gain because the city's merchants are relatively pro-Russian, and he secures this by abolishing taxes for a year. It's from this point, really, because before the capture of Tashkent, the main Russian base of operations was Orenburg, which is on this map. Russia controls most of what's now modern-day Kazakhstan.
It's much, much further to the north, just to give a little bit of context for that, how decisive a shift this is towards the south. In terms of borders, I mean, it's kind of like the difference between, I don't know, moving your base of operations from Stockholm to Palermo.
Because Hopko does mention that this whole area is about like half the size of the United States. So it's an absolutely massive stretch of territory, and certainly does help the Russians provide more bases of operations as they move into Central Asia. And what's fascinating is after what seems like a very long time, the Russians very swiftly carve a path through Central Asia, because from 1864 until 1885, that 20-year period, they conquer all of Central Asia. So after the fall of Tashkent, you then have what the Russians do is they try to ensure that there's sufficient diplomatic cover for when doing these maneuvers to not get the eye of the British too much. So when they capture Tashkent, they're arguing, well, if we didn't intervene, the Khan of Bukhara would have just annexed the city, and we can't let them get too big or powerful. So is also from this point in Tashkent, it becomes the new center of operations in Central Asia, and the Russians set up a new governor of Turkestan. It's the Russian General Kaufman's made the governor general, and he's really the one calling the shots for the next 30 years or so in Russian Central Asia. And it's at this point that the Russians then kind of force the Rump Khanate of Kokand into vassalage to separate it from the other Khanate. So very much a strategy of divide and conquer. So the Russians then conquer Samarkand in 1868 from Bukhara, and then they vassalize the rest of Bukhara from that point. In terms of other bases of operations on the east coast of the Caspian Sea, roughly where we can see the Turkmen revolt, on that sort of peninsula, we can see that sort of juts out. That's where they build the port of Krasnodarsk, and so this allows them to send some troops and supplies from the Caucasus over the Caspian into Central Asia. So now, along with Tashkent and Samarkand, they've now got multiple points of operations now to help them carry out their further conquest and consolidation of the region. And it's also from Krasnodarsk, the Russians also build a railway called the Trans-Caspian Railway. So it starts from Krasnodarsk and it stretches across them from west to east, so through goes past Merv, which they take later in 1884. It goes past Bukhara, then obviously past Samarkand and Kokand. And this is one of the things the British find so alarming, because if the Russians are building rail lines into Central Asia, this again just makes it easier for them to prepare an army to attack into India. And it should also be mentioned, though, that it's not all smooth sailing. The Russians do suffer one embarrassment. In Turkestan, there is a city called Göktapa. The Turkomans do quite strongly resist the Russian encroachment in there in the late 1870s, which is repulsed and does lead to a significant humiliation for them, though they are able to take it, though a lot later than they would have liked. And the conquest is complete when they take Merv diplomatically in 1885, after sort of duping the city by establishing a lot of trade and economic links, but also saying, well, if you don't enter our sphere of influence, you're just going to end up falling into the British fundamentally. Is there anything you want to add regarding the conquest of Central Asia at all? Or
two completely disparate points, or maybe three. The first one will be obvious in the sense that this is basically following the model which had already been established by the British: direct annexations and passing out territories to various loyal vassals like the Emir Bukhara, who had survived the Romanovs by a couple of years before the region was forcefully integrated into the Uzbek Soviet Socialist Republic. Another point, which is, you mentioned Merv, and you earlier mentioned the significance of Herat. It's not actually on this map, which doesn't help. It's cut off a little bit before the it's not even on that map either. But anyway, Merv is just north of Herat, so it would substantiate British fears again of a push southwards, maybe into Kandahar, which was traditionally the great sort of contest region between the gunpowder empires, the Mughals and the Safavids, to be really boring and long-winded. But anyway, there's another point I want to bring up, because I haven't found anything regarding this yet, but it's something that I've been thinking about from a more conceptual point of view regarding the justifications for conquest historically for Russia. A lot of it has to do with fetishization of Greek history. And when you see the conquest of Curzon, Chersonesus, Crimea, Taurida, the Greek plan, Constantinople, even, creating a Greek courtier, Mariupol, there seems to be this, like I said, this fetishization of Greek history, and this idea that Russia is somehow embodying the Byzantine legacy. Well, these cities that you mentioned in this region lies on the old Greek kingdom of Bactria, and you can almost say that it represents the Mesopotamia of Turania, or the Mesopotamia of Turkestan, between the rivers Sir in the north and the rivers Amu in the south. If we're going to look at this as, an equivalent in Central Asia of the Euphrates and Tigris, a paradise in the Oxus as opposed to a paradise in Taurida. Indeed, if you're going to project that far back, you can take Samarkand and transform it into, the Greekified Makanda, one of the cities of Alexander the Great. If you're bearing down on the gates of Alexander, taking Derbent, taking what was the city in the east, Gurgan, on the borders of Golistan in Iran, bearing down on all these regions, was there, in your view, because again, it's something I really need to look into and find if there are any primary sources on this, but this idea basically to replicate the Greek plan in the Black Sea with the Greek plan in Central Asia, and see that, as the Greeks had, they established the kingdom of 1,000 cities in this region of Central Asia. And they, like Menander before, would expand into one of the former great Greek cities of Balkh, across the Amu, across the old river Oxus, push forward into across the Kush, and replicate Alexander's conquest by trying to conquer India. It's just an interesting parallel that I've noted, but instead of imitating Byzantine history, you imitate Alexander. And of course, the legacy of Alexander was very apparent in terms of the impression it had on Russian history. That's the reason Tsar Alexander was called Alexander, for that exact reason. So I wonder, because again, like I said, I haven't seen the primary sources, but whether there was this impression on the Russian officers, who were perhaps as historically cognizant, if not more so than I, that they were recreating this legacy in Central Asia. Indeed, you can see this as part of a desire to romanticize a forerunner attempt of European colonization in the region, albeit the Russians were mimicking the Greeks now.
Well, that's a really interesting parallel. I know you've mentioned stuff about the Greek plan of Catherine the Great previously, but this other idea. No, that's very interesting. That's not something I'd ever thought of, but I can definitely see the logic behind it. That certainly would be worth looking into the primary material for that. No, so thank you for showing that. Okay. Yeah, so after the consolidation of Central Asia, there's actually one other thing I forgot to mention earlier, which I want to mention now before we come off Central Asia, which is there's actually a very interesting move the British did in the early years of the Great Game to stop the Russians expanding to Central Asia, because one of the reasons the Russians justified their conquest was that the Khanates had hundreds, if not thousands, of Russian slaves serving them, and the Russians used the excuse of wanting to liberate their subjects as reasons for leading expeditions into Central Asia. And there's actually a early episode of the Great Game in the 1840s where an officer called Richmond Shakespeare goes to Khiva, where his whole purpose is to encourage the Khan to free his slaves, because the British know that the Russians have got a armed expedition on the way, and so by freeing, what he does is that he's able to free the slaves, and with an escort, he then takes them to up to Orenburg and frees them to the Russians. And so, though on the surface the Russians are happy that they've got their subjects back, in reality they're actually seething because they've now lost their excuse for taking the territories in Central Asia, and would significantly delay their conquest until the 1860s, 70s, and 80s. What's your perspective of that?
Well, the other ace up their sleeve, of course, is to cite the persecution of Orthodox missionaries in this region as well. There is obviously a parallel, because that's part of the moral justification as to why I mentioned Crimea earlier, why the Russians decided to annex Crimea for that exact reason. The centuries-long policy of the acquisition of Russian slaves. So again, it seems rather prescient and proactive for them to have realized that such a pretext would be used. Not even a pretext, that's looking at it very cynically, an actual just cause, so to speak, to tackle this issue, albeit when we talk about the Russian slave holdings of the Central Asian Emirates, is nothing on the scale of what we saw in the Black Sea.
No, certainly not, no. Okay, and so at this point, I would want to very briefly, because there was an aspect of the Great Game I wasn't actually aware of before doing my research, and it's actually over Chinese Turkestan and modern Xinjiang, because it's during this time in the aftermath of the Second Opium War and the Taiping Rebellion, where China's absolute bedlam, and it's having this massive civil war, that this province actually breaks away under a local Turkic ruler called Yakub Beg, and he's able to rule that province for about 15-20 years. And it's quite interesting because both the British and Russians send delegations to him to try and win him over to their side. But what he does is that he realizes there's a benefit to not being beholden to either side too much, and so he plays both sides off each other, accepting a Russian delegation, but then not committing to a hard alliance, and accepting a British one, accepting trade, but again avoiding any hard alliances, and is able to hold on to it until the Qing are able to somewhat consolidate their position and then push back in to reconquer their territory. Are you at all familiar with this sort of state of Kashgar from before at all? Or
It sounds like a 19th century Sheng Shikai. I guess no one's going to get that reference, so it's pointless.
I know what you mean. And for those who are watching, Sheng Shikai was the warlord of Xinjiang during the 30s and 40s. He was effectively a puppet of the Soviets and an avenue of Soviet influence in China.
I don't think it's fair to say he was, a puppet in the same way you've elucidated. With the previous warlord, I think it's fair to say that Sheng Shikai was prepared to switch sides at short notice, which indeed he was basically bought off from his position of warlord in order to join Chiang Chiang Kai-shek's government. So I think there are parallels there.
Okay. I mean, I was aware of him tangentially, but thank you for correcting that. So, and now I think it's at this point it's worth wheeling back to Afghanistan, because we then have the Second Anglo-Afghan War, and so obviously by this point, Dost Muhammad, after he was restored in 1843, he ruled for another 20 years and until 1863, and it's at this point that we've got his son Shah Ali, who is on the throne, and it's at this point that again the Russians, after they've been consolidating Central Asia, do send another mission to Afghanistan to try and woo them over into a Russian alliance. And again, Shah Ali is not cautious enough in dealing with this delegation, and the British, again fearing concerns, then again invade Afghanistan. So this war is, though it does have its setbacks, is not, I would say, much more successful than the first war. So early on, again, you have the occupation of Kabul. However, you then have this other tribal uprising where the Bala Hissar, the fortress in Kabul, occupied by the Anglo-Indian forces, is put under siege by the Afghans, and they are able to drive the British out after a long siege. However, the British then at this point send another army under, I think it's General Robertson, back into Afghanistan, and he's very successfully able to hold on to their position, and he actually is able to lead another siege of Kabul, which he's able to fend off a absolutely massive force of about 50,000 Afghans. It almost feels a little bit like an Afghan equivalent of the of like the Battle of Rorke's Drift or something, because funnily enough, I think that was actually the same year, 1878. So that's a parallel for you. But from this point, eventually, what ends up happening is the British end up accepting a relative of Shah Ali onto the throne of Afghanistan. What's interesting is that he had actually spent many years in exile in Samarkand, and was some of the Russians were using to hope to try and put their own claim on the throne of Afghanistan. But what ends up happening is he enters Afghanistan during this chaos, and the British decide to offer him the throne, because Shah Ali has shown himself not to be trusted, and so they end up going with the other candidate, and he ends up proving a lot more loyal, and so they end up stealing the Russians' own candidate from underneath them. Sorry, I was blanking on his name, but I believe his name was actually Ayub Khan. So, is there anything you wanted to add regarding the Second Anglo-Afghan War at all, or?
No, not really.
Because all I'd say is that the main outcomes of it are that Afghanistan is formally becomes a British protectorate. No foreign power is to have any dealings with the Afghans unless it's through the British government first. But the British government commits itself to the defence of Afghanistan, to any foreign invasions or attacks or any violations of Afghan's territorial integrity. The British are going to back up and defend them. And this actually does become quite a sensitive issue, because if you look on this map on the right, you can see that the territory in the northeast of Afghanistan, just north of India and west of China, is you've got these territories in the Pamir Mountains, and it's a complete mess. There's lots of these little tiny princely states, and what doesn't help this region is that it's largely unmapped, and so it's not really clear where the frontiers exactly begin. And then,
of course, we have the very accurate historical retelling of the man who would be king.
Yeah, sadly, that's a film I've not got around to seeing yet. But
Rudyard Kipling. If you brought up Kim earlier.
Yeah, sorry, it's a book by him, but of course there's the film as well with Michael Caine, which I'd like to see at some point. So no, but thank you for that allusion. Yeah, so around this time you do see many British officers, such as France's young husband, go and explore the area, trying to map it, and the Russians also send their own Cossack officers into the region as well. And the British really want to try and firmly map out where the boundaries are, so that it's not easy for the Russians just to sneak an army force through and then invade India. And it's around this time in the it's about 1885 to 1887. You have the Afghan Boundary Commission, which is designed to get an actual concrete boundary set up between Russia and Afghanistan. And there's an incident here called the Panjshir incident, where Panjshir is a small oasis town on the border between Russian Turkestan and Afghanistan, and the Russians decide they want to try and just sort of take the town and provoke an incident. So they march on the town. The Afghans warn them that if you march in, we're going to shoot and resist you. And the Russians march in without attacking or firing, because they don't want to be seen as the aggressors. So they march in, the Afghans fire, then they use that as an excuse to then drive the Afghans out and claim the town for themselves. So this incident significantly raises tensions between the British and the Russians, because the Russians are flagrantly violating the border, even though there's a boundary commission to actually try and formally establish a boundary, though this is completed largely by 1887. And if I just come back to this map, so we see the modern boundary between Afghanistan and Turkestan, Uzbekistan, and Tajikistan is largely comes out of this boundary commission, which is obviously significantly different from the old boundaries we saw there. The one exception is this little bit panhandle in the east, the Wakhan corridor. As I mentioned, the Pamir region was very hardly mapped at this point, and this is where the real weakness is that the British are concerned about. And it's not until the 1890s that Britain is able to recognise with Russia that the Wakhan corridor will be Afghan territory. Though it should be noted, it's obviously very thin. It's only, I think, 10 kilometers wide at its narrowest point. So you want to come in with something?
No, I was going to mention that this is one of the most inexplicable triumphs of territorial contrivance I think I've seen, this bizarre little panhandle, because you have to contextualize it and see that if you look at Kashmir, what was it, Uttar Pradesh, all these regions in northern India, which have just become complete bedlam in terms of trying to establish who is in charge of this region. In terms of Kashmir, we have India, we have Pakistan, and we have China claiming parts of the same region. The fact that this little panhandle has survived is really a miracle.
Well, largely it was a contrivance because the British don't want their borders
they wanted to establish a border between China and Afghanistan to make sure there was no land border. Yes, but like I said, it does seem to be a miracle that's still there to this day.
Yeah, no, that's a fair point considering how thin it is, but certainly, because it's interesting you bring up the Chinese, because the British also try to get the Qing to send forces in as well, because ultimately they've even though they're from power, they still want the Qing to consolidate it, because having concrete consolidated territory is better than having a vague unassurance as to where the border ends, which is something the Russians can just exploit. So, and then you mentioned that there's general chaos, because in the 1890s there was a war over Chitral, where the ruler Aman al-Mulk dies, and he's got something absurd like a dozen sons who are all fighting over the throne. So the British fight a small war to just secure this this chaotic region. And in terms of the frontiers of Afghanistan, to come back to this map, but in 1893 you have the Durand Line, which forms the modern boundary between Afghanistan and Pakistan, and is established as well in what was then India's northwestern frontier. And so from this point, there's only really two more things to discuss in the broad scheme of things. So I mentioned France's young husband, but another area where the British and Russians are trying to establish influence is over Tibet, because at this time it was largely autonomous from the Qing. Well, by this point, Nicholas I has become Tsar, and he expresses an interest in a defensive pact with the Tibetans. And at this point, Lord Curzon is the Viceroy of India, and having someone who actually travelled in Central Asia and in Persia, he was very cognizant of the threat of the Russians and their logistical position vis-a-vis India. And so he again is trying to shore up the defences. So he sends two expeditions under young husband to Tibet. The first one is unsuccessful. The Tibetans just refused to come out of their monasteries or forts to meet with the British. But then the second one, which is sent in December 1903, it's very important because that coincides roughly with the Russo-Japanese War, and obviously at this time Britain signed the Anglo-Japanese alliance in 1902, largely aimed against the Russians in East Asia, and I largely see that with this mission, Britain was kind of using the cover of that war to then push into what they thought was Russia's sphere of influence. But when they're marching in, there's an incident where the Tibetans go to block the British marching in because, unlike the first expedition, the second one is armed. About 1,000 Gurkhas are sent along with young husbands and some British officers, and when they try to force their way in, the Tibetans attack, and then the British are forced to slaughter them, and then this supposed diplomatic mission ends up becoming a bit of a wild, violent raid into Tibet. It's like a forced negotiation, ultimately, with the great fortress of Gyatso on the way to Lhasa, the capital, falling. And when the British arrive there, though, they find that, there's actually no Russian presence here. There's no great stockpiles of weapons. There's no supplies. And so they end up walking away with sort of egg on their face as a result of this. Is there any further context you wanted to add regarding Tibet or the Russo-Japanese War at this time? Or
well, I mean, in my view, we're going away from Central Asia here, but I mean, you can't understand the context between the relationship between these two powers and not really underscore the significance of the Russo-Japanese War. When you look at the policies of Alexander II, who, but for context, reigned between as Tsar of Russia from 1856 until 1881, part of the genius in his foreign policy was that he became Tsar during the Crimean War and then spent the next 25 years consolidating control over a region which threatened British India. And yet, when he was strong enough, he was in a position to take the fight to the Balkans and seriously alter the status of Russia in the Black Sea with the Treaty of San Stefano and ultimately with the Congress of Berlin. So he was able to make major advances for Russia on several fronts, with the exception of his sale of Alaska. Now look at Nicholas II. He is the complete opposite. He is trying to appeal and make alliances without consolidating his position first. As you mentioned, Russia was never in a position to support Tibet in any way, logistically or in terms of serious aid, because it would have entailed Russian control over Xinjiang or East Turkestan, control over the Tarim Basin, which of course the British would not countenance as much as the loss of Tibet. This is repeated on a much bigger scale with Korea, which Tsar Nicholas II also tried to induce into the Russian camp. Korea, which had just been firmly established to be in Japanese influence following the Sino-Japanese War of 1895. So now you have Tsar Nicholas I blundering into conflicts on all fronts, which of course would characterize Russia's entry into World War I as well. And the British had formed an alliance with Japan in 1902. So what the Russo-Japanese War did, rather than just leave the Russians with egg on their face in terms of, the Tibetan situation, is cut out the real possibility of Russia establishing finally a major maritime presence on an ocean which could have threatened Britain, which would have been in Port Arthur and the Liaoning Peninsula, Manchuria and Korea. And they did it by proxy, which, compared to the example you mentioned of Rorke's Drift or Afghanistan, which you can say were overstretches in some cases. So ultimately, you can say that what I view the Great Game in Central Asia is really much of a sideshow, because the two decisive theatres of the conflict were in the Crimean War with the Black Sea and the Russo-Japanese War with the Pacific. And the reason I say that is because the Russians had a tangible prospect of establishing a maritime presence via those theatres. As you can tell, people listening to this stream, Russia never had any real prospect of seriously threatening India or establishing a maritime presence on the Indian Ocean. Central Asia was far more reserved in terms of the the direct threats to Britain's sphere of influence, even though the British definitely thought otherwise. And with their confirmed suzerainty over Afghanistan, I mean, you mentioned the logistical problems. I mean, Russia could barely supply its army in Sevastopol. The idea of Russia launching a full-scale invasion of British India is complete and utter insanity. At best, if the Russians ever consolidated Afghanistan, which the British never firmly achieved, by the way, they could have perhaps tried to pit the rulers of India against the British by paying them. And if you're going to look at who can actually afford to pay off the British subjects in India, it's the British. They have a lot more to lose by allying against Britain than they do by allying with the Russians, than by remaining true. So, yeah. And the great knock-on effect, I believe, of understanding the major victory of Britain in the Russo-Japanese War by their Japanese proxy is it establishes the condition for the Russo-Anglo-Persian Convention, or the Anglo-Russian Persian Convention, which definitively delineates spheres of influence and gives the Russians the impression that they've actually entered into some form of entente, hence why it's therefore known as the Triple Entente between France, Britain, and Russia after 1907. So, ironically, or perhaps appropriately, given what I've just mentioning, in the same way that the Crimean War informs so much of what's happening in this region, it's the Russo-Japanese War that, again, is informing so much policy in this region, that ironically, the Great Game is a bit of a misnomer because, as I try to explain in my lecture on this, it is the little game within the context of the Great Game, and why that's so important to understand is the fact that all the great decisive moves of the Great Game are happening well beyond the sphere. It really is, a sideshow of the larger Cold War. So yeah, that's my view, at least.
No, and I don't really disagree with that. Again, as Ed Hopkirk mentions in his book, this is the idea of the myth of the Great Game, and I think when reading that book, as good as it was, one of my problems with it is that I think it was a little bit too wanting to indulge in the narrative. It's like 500 pages long, and half of it is him talking about various officers on the little adventures around Central Asia, and France's young husband sat down with this Russian officer and they had vodka and they toasted the Queen Victoria and Tsar Alexander, and it's all that's all well and good, but can you actually get to the strategy?
But doesn't
No,
that actually substantiate the view, though, that we're talking about a series of adventures rather than a serious prospect of, say, for example, the Russians breaking into modern-day Pakistan?
Oh no, that's a fair point. I mean, it's still a good book overall. I just wished it, for the purpose of the research, I wish it could have been a bit more abridged and just looked at some of the more broader consequences. But no, I don't entirely disagree with what you're saying. The East is very very much important, and just to sort of touch off regarding the 1907 convention. So, what it ultimately is that Iran is carved up into two spheres of influence. The Russians are given the northern half of the country, and the British are given this little area in the southeast in Balochistan. And this is, you could almost say, if British policy was all about creating like a great barrier or wall around India, and this really is like the last piece of it, isn't it? They finally have this like great barrier around India, which is completed. Even though it's a lot less territory, it's the bit of territory that matters because it's the only avenue that you could get from Iran into India. And also importantly, it shows up the British position in the Persian Gulf, which is very important because next year in 1908, William Knox Darcy discovers oil at Abadan, and then you have the creation of the Anglo-Persian Oil Company. So you have the further influence in the Gulf there as well.
Yes, and like I emphasized earlier with the Russian interest in Baku, again, Persia is so significant in terms of understanding this, and it's the loss of Persian great power status and sovereignty, which I don't know, maybe that is actually a bigger sort of story than just talking about the Russian sort of British rivalry, talking about the narrative of Persia here, because it's important to understand this within the context of the situation that leads to the creation of the Qajari dynasty and the fall of the Pahlavi dynasty in 1879. It's so much informed by this question in terms of perhaps making it more of a Persian-centric conversation. And you mentioned these little lines. I mean, these little lines don't really mean anything in the grand scheme of things. I mean, the big takeaway from this, because Russia isn't going to invade India by Baluchistan, nor does it really matter if there's a line of influence, because is Russia really going to invade the Zagros Mountains? It's the fact that Russians have no entrepot into the sea. That's what matters. So long as the Russians are kept out of the Persian Gulf, and they're kept out of most of the oil-producing regions, then the British aren't giving anything to the Russians here. They can't control northern Iran. They have no interest to. They're simply confirming that Russia won't get its hands on Iranian oil and a point of access to the sea. They've won. This is an admission of Russian defeat. Like I said, if Russia was going to turn Central Asia into a flashpoint equivalent to that of Manchuria or Crimea, the Dardanelles and the Bosphorus Straits, they fail to even get to step one in this region. The British have got everything they want, and yeah.
And so we could almost say that the British policy at this point is, rather than stopping the Russians' advance, let's give them, token, concessions.
Let's pretend this is a collaboration.
And yeah, so we'll just dupe them into thinking they've won or something. And
no, we're conceding the influence of this territory. It's not like we can never project influence, even if we tried.
No, exactly. And just to go over some of the other points of this convention, Russia also formally recognises that Afghanistan is British responsibility, and it is a British protectorate, and that any dealings they are to have with Britain are to go have with Afghanistan are to come via Britain, and that's the main thing really. And also Russia does have access to trade in Afghanistan as well as another point, but it's mainly that's all the main points of that really. And this is generally seen as the end of the Great Game.
Well, what do you know? The irony is? The irony is that the last nation to have serious designs on Afghanistan as some sort of way to thwart the British weren't the Russians, but the Germans. The Germans deluded themselves into thinking that the emir of Afghanistan would serve as some sort of great vanguard in the revolution of all of India's Muslims under the leadership of the German ally, the Sultan, who was also the Caliph of Islam. So if you're looking at fantastical machinations in this region, it ends with the Germans, weirdly enough, in terms of the great power period before the Russian Revolution.
No, thank you for bringing that up, because Sean McMeekin's got a very interesting book I read a few years ago called the Berlin-Baghdad Railway, and it's looking at the sort of German Ottoman alliance during World War One, and he very much goes into this grand sort of grand jihad plan and how kind of mental it was. So if people are interested, I'd recommend giving that book a read. He gives a lot more detail on that. Obviously, as I said, the Great Game was generally accepted ending in 1907, but there were some interesting parallels later on, because of course in 1941, Britain and the Soviet Union during World War II engaged in a second partition of Iran, though this time it's a lot more concrete, because the country's actually invaded, and again it's split up into two zones, and this is obviously leads to the fall of Reza Khan Pahlavi and the accession of his son. And this is when we went over it on your stream on the grand strategy of Stalin's empire, but the main benefit of that was to ensure lend-lease equipment could reach the Soviets during the war, and then of course later on you've mentioned there's the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan during the 79 to 89, and of course, ever since the collapse of the Soviet Union and the independence of all these various countries like Uzbekistan, Kazakhstan, etc., there's this idea of the new great game, competing influence over Central Asia. So it's not just the Russians and the West, but of course you've got the Chinese now as well. So it's all a bit up in the air now. It's not just the British and Russians anymore. And if people are interested, Semi Agog has got a couple of streams on his channel looking at the more modern great game. So yeah, other than that, are there any final comments you want to sort of make at all, AM, at all? Or
No, just thank you very much for having me on.
no, and thank you again for coming on. It's always great to get your perspective and your wisdom. And again, earlier in the stream, I said one of the reasons I was interested in this was mainly just trying to understand the current British position in Ukraine. And it's not a perfect answer, but I have somewhat better understanding. There was a rivalry between Britain and Russia in this period, but there was at least somewhat logic where Britain actually had an empire to preserve and defend, unlike today, where we just seem to do this ridiculous policy because why the hell not? Fuck Russia, basically.
Yes, my views towards this subject are becoming very dark at the moment. So, like I said, that's an important thing to emphasize. Like I mentioned with the Russo-Japanese War, why I find it a fascinating sort of cap-off for the subject is that narratively everything fits. Perhaps that's my main weakness in terms of my interest in history, is the fact I like establishing the narrative, but it helps me to understand at least. Whereas such a narrative doesn't really exist in a coherent fashion regarding modern day.
No. Well, again, thank you everybody for watching, and thanks for coming on again, AM. So in terms of streams, we mentioned the first Anglo-Afghan War earlier. Well, tomorrow night on Iron Duke's channel, he has a new series called Splendid Isolation History, and hopefully tomorrow we should be discussing the first Anglo-Afghan War in a lot more detail. So if people are interested in the sort of conflict and the battle, and people such as Alexander Burns and Bakara Burns, then stay tuned and give that a watch, and you can really enjoy us to talk about one of the worst British military disasters in history. Funnily enough, Iron Duke covered the Battle of Asandalwana last week, so we seem to be going on a bit of a trend at the moment in covering British military disasters.
No, and everyone, thank you, Iron Duke. I've seen you in the chat, and everyone check out your channel. I apologize when it comes to military history. I'd much rather pontificate on the Russo Neo-Bactrian fantasy than talk about the logistics and the battles of the Second Afghan War. So just thank you again for having me on.
No, is there anything you would like to share?
No, just thank you for having me on again.
Certainly. Okay. Other than that, funny enough, also you mentioned looking at the history of Iran and its sort of diminution as a result of the British and the Russians. Well, as people know, I've done many streams with my friend Hunger on various aspects of Middle Eastern and Oriental history. Well, he's in Lebanon at the moment, but when he does return, we are planning on doing a stream on modern Iran from the 1905 constitutional revolution up until at least the end of the Iran-Iraq war. So if people are interested in that as an extension of this, then certainly give that a watch. That'll probably be the second half of March, I would think, if not maybe April. So stay tuned for that. And of course, every week I have my weekly show, the archival discourses, and I recently did release channel memberships. So if you want to support my work and support, then please consider becoming a member. So thank you very much, everybody, for watching, and have a good evening.